Okay, well, hello everybody and welcome to the primary progressive aphasia support group webinar that is run by Rare Dementia Support. I can see the numbers are trickling up, so that's great. My name is Chris Hardy. I'm a researcher at University College London, and I've worked with the PPA support group here for I think nearly 10 years now. So I'm sad not to be able to see friendly faces myself from here, but hello to those of you who I know. And a very, very warm welcome to those of you who are new as well. So after the last webinar, we had a lot of requests for updates about research into PPA. And so that's the theme for today's session. And we've got 4 short talks or interviews to kick things off in the first part of the session. And after those, we'll go into a Q&A session. And I should say that Professor Jason Warren, who often chairs these meetings, sends his apologies for not being here himself today, but I'm really pleased that we'll be joined by an excellent panel of people with different experiences and expertise to help answer your questions later. There are a few housekeeping notices that I've been asked to read out as well, so please note that if you have any questions to ask the panel, please put these in the Q&A box. So you can do this at any time. There's no need to wait until the Q&A session starts. And there's also an option to submit your question anonymously if you tick the little box that says post as anonymous. The chat box has been disabled for the meeting, so don't be alarmed if you're used to seeing that and it's not there. The webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything or if you need to step away for a moment or two, please don't worry. You can catch up on the recording on the YouTube channel about a week after the session, and we'll send a link around to everybody when it's ready. And just note that if there are any useful resources or links that are mentioned today, don't worry about noting these down because we'll send these out in a follow-up email as well. And just a few notices to read. So I've been asked to tell you about the PPA Carers peer support group that meets on the 3rd Wednesday of every month at 2 p.m. for 90 minutes and is held on Zoom. And there is also a peer support group for people living with a diagnosis of PPA, and this meets on the 3rd Thursday of every month at 11 a.m. for 90 minutes, again held on Zoom. And both groups are a lovely opportunity to meet people who might be in similar situations to yourselves. And if you'd like to find out more or to join either group, please email contact@raredementiasupport.org. And this part's in capital letters, so it must be important. Do not declare your interest in the Q&A box. So do email contact@raredementiasupport.org, but don't write that in the Q&A box. And finally, just to give you advance notice of our next PPA support group meeting. So this will be a hybrid meeting, meaning that it will take place in real life, face-to-face in London on September the 23rd, 2022, and will also be live streamed if you're unable to join us. And we'll send out more details about that in due course. So I think that's all of the things I was asked to read out. So without further ado, let's head into our first talk, which is a pre-recorded video kindly made by Dr. Nadia Magdalinou, who will be talking about clinical trials in PPA.
Hello, my name is Nadia Magdalinou. I'm a neurologist and I'm part of the RDS team. And I'm also working as a clinical research fellow in our experimental unit at UCLH. Today, I'm going to talk to you about exciting clinical trials available for people living with frontotemporal dementia. So to give you an overview of my talk, first of all, I'm going to talk about what's the clinical trials pathway for all drug development. Then I'm going to talk about some challenges we have in PPA, because there is a discrepancy between the clinical and the pathological diagnosis. So that creates difficulties in terms of drug developments. Then I'm going to focus on a subgroup of a genetic form of FTD called progranulin mutation carriers, and a very exciting drug that has been developed for this specific group of patients. And I'm going to present the results and summarize the findings and future directions. So how do we get a drug from the discovery phase to the general population? So first of all, there is obviously a phase in the lab, and that if that's successful, then this is tested, the medication is tested in animal models. And if that's successful, then we move to human participants. So initially in phase 1 trials, healthy participants are tested. And if the medication is well tolerated, then disease participants are also included, but it's a small number initially. So if phase 1 is successful, then we move to phase 2 with a larger number of disease participants. And we're testing that not only safety, but also whether the medication is effective. And if phase 2 trial is successful, then we move to phase 3 trial. And the gold standard there is to continue testing how effective the medication is and how safe and in different doses, but also to test it against a dummy drug, a placebo. So usually phase 3 trials are randomized control trials. And if these are successful, then approval for to give the medication to the general population in FDA, for example, in the US is applied, and then the drug can be available to everyone. So for primary progressive aphasia, the diagnostic criteria are only clinical, and that is very important to think about. So as you know, is a language-led cognitive decline, and the most prominent deficit at symptom onset is aphasia. As the disease progresses, other domains are also included. The gold standard, despite PPA being a clinical diagnosis, the gold standard in terms of a definite diagnosis remains a pathological diagnosis. So what is the abnormal proteins we find in the brain? And that is a big challenge, because as you see, as you probably know, there are difficult PPA subtypes, but again, these are also clinical. So for example, semantic dementia usually has underlying TDP-43 pathology, or progressive non-fluent aphasia usually has tau pathology, but it can also have TDP-43 pathology in some patients. Or the logopenic variant usually has Alzheimer's disease pathology, but can also have different pathologies. So that is challenging, because in order to develop drugs, you need to target the specific pathology in the brain and not the clinical presentation. So in order to illustrate this point further, is like trying to pacify a group of very angry people who maybe externally manifest their anger in a similar way by shouting or stamping their feet or fuming. But the cause for the anger may be different. So if you want to help them, you can't really say to someone that you can go and see a counselor for your relationship worries, when the reason why he's upset is because of work-related stress. Or you can vote for a different political party if they're worried about Partygate, when the real reason of them being angry is because they have noisy neighbors. So we need, in order to help them to deal with the underlying cause, and not look at the external manifestation of their anger. In a similar way, for PPA, we need a drug to treat the underlying pathology. So now we'll talk about genetic forms of PPA. And progranulin mutations are the most common genetic form of genetic progressive non-fluent aphasia, FTD syndrome. It is inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion, which means that if I inherit mutation from one of my parents, I have a 50% chance of having it and a 50% chance of giving it to my children. There is no abnormal accumulation of the progranulin protein in the brain, but progranulin carriers, we know that they have an abnormal accumulation of TDP-43. And what do these mutations cause? So these mutations result in reduced levels of progranulin, both in the blood and in the cerebrospinal fluid, which is a fluid bathing the brain and the spinal cord, and it gives us a good indication of what's happening in the brain. So in theory, boosting progranulin levels would be a promising treatment for this group of patients. And actually, there is another protein called sortulin, which plays a key role in the regulation of progranulin levels. And if you block this by an experimental medication, you could potentially increase the availability of progranulin levels in blood and CSF. And in this graph on the left-hand side, you can see that in around the circles, you can see the lower progranulin levels in the plasma or the blood and in the cerebrospinal fluid of both presymptomatic carriers. These are people who carry the abnormal mutations, but they don't have a clinical syndrome yet. They haven't developed frontotemporal dementia, and people who carry the abnormal mutation and have developed the disease. So you can see they have similar levels, and which are much lower compared to, on the left-hand side, you can see the healthy controls. On the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that if we block sortulin protein, then we make progranulin much more available for the body. So this was the sort of discovery phase, and which went well. And now we move to the phase 1 trial. So looking at the effect of this experimental drug blocking sortulin in humans. So that phase 1 trial is called INFRONT-1. And essentially the main point is to see, does this experimental drug work? What is the effect of different doses, and is it safe? And we have good results from this study. So we found that the experimental drug called AL001 blocks sortulin in healthy volunteers. It triples progranulin levels in healthy volunteers in the blood. And there is also a dose-dependent drug activity. So the higher the dose of the medication, the greater the progranulin levels. So in this graph, we can see the effect of this medication in progranulin levels in cerebrospinal fluid. And we can see on the left-hand side that there's a good effect. The levels increase, and the levels increase, the higher the dose of the medication, the higher the levels. On the right-hand side, we can see also that the drug effect remains for a long period of time. So it's not just a little spike of progranulin levels in the CSF. So because we're happy with how phase 1 trial went, we progress now to phase 2 trial, and we now test a larger number of disease participants. And this is called INFRONT-2. And it's a multi-center trial, and it's an open label. So all participants receive the trial medication. And in this graph, we see that, that we replicated the results that we saw in healthy volunteers in disease participants again, and that we see on the left-hand side that the experimental medication triples progranulin levels in plasma of FTD progranulin patients. In the middle, we see that the experimental drug doubles the levels in CSF of FTD progranulin patients. And on the right-hand side is a very important slide because it shows that the level of progranulin in the CSF in our disease participants is the same like in healthy controls, and that's very important. The environment bathing the brain essentially has become, in terms of progranulin, the same like healthy controls. So what kind of endpoints? So this is all good about sort of looking at progranulin levels, but at the end of the day, if the patients clinically remain affected, it doesn't really make a difference. So we test the effectiveness of this medication, but looking both at blood and CSF biomarkers of inflammation and degeneration, so neuronal loss. We're looking at imaging to see if there's further shrinkage of the brain in different scans in different time points. And finally, and most importantly, we're looking at cognitive testing of participants to see how they're doing in a year's time, for example. And we also test the study partners, usually someone who is their spouse has regular contact with them, and they give us collateral history of how the disease participant is doing. So the summary of the INFRONT-2 trial is that the medication is well tolerated, which is great. It has the desired effect, so it rapidly gets progranulin levels both in the blood and in the CSF. It rapidly increases them, and there is a desired effect for up to a year, which is great. And also, the experimental drug demonstrated beneficial effect on disease biomarkers in the CSF, which indicates that there is stabilization or prevention of further neuronal loss, which is very important. And the most important finding is that the experimental drug treatment slowed cognitive progression by around 48%. So this we compared it with a similar group without any intervention participating in another genetic FTD study. So because we're happy with what happened in phase 2 trial, now we move to phase 3 trials, which is as we mentioned earlier, also involves an arm that receives a dummy medication. So not only are we testing the experimental drug, but we're testing the same group of disease participants without having an infusion that is nothing, to see how they're doing compared to the participants who are receiving the medication. And this, we are testing people at this moment, and we're actively enrolling. So to summarize, PPA is a clinical diagnosis, and we need better molecular characterization to allow accurate diagnosis. So we call them biomarkers, in order to develop targeted treatments. Progranulin mutation plays an important role in familial FTD, resulting in low levels of progranulin, both in the blood and in the CSF. And we showed the results of an experimental drug, L001, which has been developed to increase progranulin levels. And we have very promising results, both from phase 1 and phase 2 trials, showing good tolerability, reduction in pathological markers associated with disease severity, and reduction in cognitive decline. And that's why we are actively recruiting for phase 3. So these are our contact details at UCLH and DRC trial unit, if you want to get in touch. And thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much to Nadia for that really thorough and helpful overview. And I thought that was really great, and a nice summary of the different types of PPA at the start as well. And Nadia is on holiday today, so she won't be joining us for the panel later, but please do send your questions through anyway, and we'll do our best to answer them. And if not, we can send them to her afterwards as well. So we'll move on now to our next talk, which was another talk pre-recorded by Jess Jiang, who is a PhD student working with me and with Jason Warren at the Dementia Research Centre.
So hi everyone, I'm Jess. I'm a PhD researcher in Professor Jason Warren's lab at the Dementia Research Centre, and today I'll be providing an update on the research being conducted at the Dementia Research Centre that you can be involved in. First, it's always very important to address the big question of why we're doing this research. As you know very well, with your first-hand experience, either as someone living with a diagnosis of PPA or as someone who is related to or knows someone living with PPA, the kind of difficulties you're faced with and the distress that comes with in performing certain daily tasks. And these difficulties can include problems with hearing and sleep. So as a research group, we are particularly interested in these symptoms because we know from your personal accounts that these functions are impacted in PPA and can directly affect your life on a daily basis. Now, at present, we still do not fully understand why particular forms of PPA manifest with such symptoms and why individuals with the same PPA diagnosis may be differentially affected by the disease. So by investigating how our brain processes different types of information, such as our perception of speech and music, or what happens in our brains when we're sleeping, we are hoping to uncover how different forms of PPA disrupts brain functioning. Therefore, in the long run, and very much thanks to your contributions to this research, we are hoping to be able to develop new, accurate, and efficient tools to aid in future diagnoses. So around this, I'd like to show you some of the data that I've collected so far based on our efforts to understand the brain and some of the symptoms that you've informed us about. So I've particularly been looking at individuals living with PPA's ability to listen to degraded speech. So we do hear speech on a daily basis, but it's hardly ever crystal clear. There's always noise happening around us, but also other distortions that can occur, such as speaking through a telephone or myself speaking to you through an electronic device at the moment. So therefore, it was very important to study speech reception, but also under a degraded manner because it's more realistic. And we know from your accounts that this is difficult with the diagnosis of PPA. So what I've done is I've used an artificial distortion so that I could, in a very controlled and graded manner, see how much distortion I can cause to sound, and yet for people to still hear it. So for example, here you can see at the top panel here, that the speech is quite clear looking. This is what clear speech would look like on a spectrogram, as we call it. And then it goes down to 24 channels. You can see that it gets a bit smudgier and less clear, even in the diagram here, and it's reflected in the sound. So I'll play you an example right now. 526. So a bit more husky, like someone has a bad cold. And it can go even further down. So we've put it all the way down to one channel here, and you can see it's very smudgy and very unclear. And that's very reflected in the sound as well, where it's basically impossible to hear what's being said. So like this. So yeah. So thanks to you all, I've been able to finish my data collection on this. So I'll be showing some of the results we have here. So as you can see here, this is the increase in the detail on the channels I showed you earlier. And this is the increase in the perception, or how much you can actually hear the speech that's happening. So, so here you can see that as the detail of the degraded speech increases, the amount of the speech that is heard also increases. And this increase is quite sharp and drastic for our healthy volunteer group, which is shown in this black line here. But it is less drastic in our different PPA groups. Particularly, you can see the logopenic group in the green line. This is definitely not as sharp, and this reflects your reports on difficulties listening to degraded speech on a daily basis. Now, what's particularly promising is that we've been able to develop these ROC curves from the data. So these are graphs that can show a diagnostic ability. And in this, I've used the perception of degraded speech as a classifier. So this is comparing our healthy volunteers with our participants living with PPA, and the results are really promising. So the area under the curve is 0.82, which can be interpreted and therefore is considered an excellent classifier of diagnostic ability. So what do these results actually mean? So first of all, we're able to systematically show that our research, that the communication difficulties of individuals living with PPA is not just limited to your language abilities, but can translate to your hearing perception as well. And second of all, this paradigm is the first step towards us using easy to administer methods like this to provide an early detection of diseases. And not only that, they can provide key markers to track disease progression, therefore particularly important for work in clinical trials, as at the moment there are no good rapid and dynamic markers available to measure outcomes in trials. And finally, there is also a crucial element that PPA affects individuals all around the world. Predominantly, the research has been done in English. But this hearing measure we've showcased here is therefore not limited to just languages or certain cultures, but rather can be used cross-culturally and cross-linguistically. We are still doing many research activities that you can be involved with at the DRC. And of course, you'll also be hearing from other research activities in different talks today, either with RDS or with other clinical trials as well. So the ones I'm mentioning here are considered observational studies, which means that they're designed to help us understand the brain and how PPA affects the brain, which is crucial for us to then develop therapies to treat these diseases in the future. So the first is the general brain behavior group research, which is led by Professor Jess Jiang. Here's a bit of a fun lab picture of us. And we're working to understand how people's thoughts, feelings, and behavior change with the diagnosis of dementia and how this relates to the brain. And in this, you'll be asked to take part in a number of different activities, including psychology and language tasks, questionnaires, and newer tasks to assess different symptoms like we've mentioned earlier today. So the degraded speech perception research I showed you just now is built out of one of the newer tasks that we administer as part of the brain behavior group. For the brain behavior group, in a previous PPA support group meeting, we have mentioned that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to move all of our research to be conducted remotely. And this is particularly successful thanks to many of you who participated in our research, that we were able to continue our work during the pandemic. And also many of you had said that remote research was fitting, as it allowed more flexible scheduling and doing our tasks in the comfort of your own home. However, some of you have also expressed a preference for in-person research. So now we are able to see individuals for in-person visits at the Dementia Research Centre again as well. And for those of you who have never been for an in-person visit before, this is typically a 2-day visit to Queen Square, London. Because of this, we're able to be flexible with how you would like to participate in our research. So we've also sort of adopted a hybrid version where we do testing sessions that can be done at home via Zoom or Microsoft Teams, and then another half-day visit to Queen Square, London, where you can have things done such as medical assessment or the MRI brain scanning, which we cannot do remotely. So we're also conducting new sets of research, particularly looking at sleep. As you may well know, sleep problems can be present in certain PPAs. They can profoundly affect the well-being of patients and the family members. It is unfortunately very under-recognized and very understudied. Sleep is also a very promising target for treatment in dementia, so there are now studies you can be involved in to evaluate the feasibility of assessing sleep in PPA within a research study. And the sleep studies are currently all predominantly conducted remotely. We can send these headbands that can measure your brain waves at night, and that's how we assess your sleep remotely. Do let me know if you have any questions in regards to this later. Also, we have a new study coming into play, which is revolved around music therapy, and we've looked at recent neuroscientific studies and aiming to create personally relevant musical interventions in patients with PPA. And we really want to get into people's real lives and see how music affects and your listening affects in daily life. So in this matter, this initial study that we have will focus on the short-term benefits and well-being, social engagement, and motivation. So some really exciting things happening. And again, just wanted to finalize by saying that we've been and still are doing research to help us understand the brain and how PPA affects the brain. And this is so crucial in developing therapies and to treating these diseases in the future. And building on that, thanks to many of you, some of the data we've collected has now helped us better understand the brain, such as the hearing perception changes in different PPAs that I showed earlier. And we can now begin the first steps to creating good and feasible markers for diseases are not limited to certain languages and cultures. And finally, we're also excited to share that there are now new studies that you can be involved with, looking at both your sleep and also your day-to-day musical listening activities. So if you're interested in any of the studies I mentioned just now, but also if you have any questions, please do contact me via email here, and I'll try to respond as soon as possible. Likewise, I'll also be present during the Q&A session later, so if you really have any questions, please do so during then. And we will look forward to hearing from all of you and wishing you all the best. Also would like to thank some of our funders, the National Brain Appeal, Alzheimer's Society, Alzheimer's Research UK, RNID, Dunhill Medical Trust, and individual funders as well. And crucially, we would like to emphasize that none of our past research, as well as our hopes of continuing any research, would be remotely possible without all of you. So you play such a crucial role in our research efforts. So we'd like to finish by thanking you immensely for all your participation here in the future. So thank you again.
Okay, and many thanks to Jess for recording that video in advance as well. Jess has been taken ill, unfortunately, this morning, so she's not able to join us for the panel after all. But please do continue to send your questions through, and again, we'll do our best to answer them if we can't, we'll send those on to Jess. So next up, we have an interview between Nikki Zimmermann from RDS and Caron. And Caron has generously taken part in research in the research that Jess was just talking about. And this is going to be, I think, a really interesting discussion about how Caron found that research. So without further ado, we'll go into that interview now.
Good morning. It's lovely to be here, and I'm here this morning with Caron. Good morning, Caron.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And our focus today is obviously about research. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we do that, can you share a little bit about yourself and your diagnosis?
I was born in London in 1949. I have never moved far from my roots. I have lived in Highgate since 1976. I left school at 15 and I spent 9 months and as secretarial college, and I then went to work courses where I stayed most of my life. Courses was my university of life. I went in and a student secretary, and I went on to be a senior manager. It was around 2000 to 2016, I noticed I had a difficulty speaking. A friend of mine pointed it out to me first. My husband had not noticed. I went to the GP countless times. She finally sent me to a doctor who thought it was anxiety. He did an MRI scan and I couldn't see anything wrong. I didn't buy into that, but at that time, my husband, Bruce, was diagnosed with chronic pulmonary hypertension. Bruce went into the Royal Hospital in May 2000. 2019, he was in a birth hospital for a month as part of my speech problems. To look after him when he came out of hospital. I went to the GP in November 2000, and asked if I could have a second second opinion. It was diagnosed relatively recently in August 2020. The PET scan showed it up. I thought I was invincible. I am slowly coming to terms with the diagnosis of primary progressive non-affluent aphasia. I speak very slowly now and have a difficult pronouncing some of the words. The parts of my brain seems to be working perfectly or normally so far.
And I remember when you were diagnosed, first of all. So it's lovely to be on this journey, not the journey you want to be on, but it's lovely to be able to support you here, Caron.
Yes.
So what made you to decide to participate in research, do you think?
I'm very pleased to take part in the research. I don't know the past courses or kind of crowded solutions from my particular problems. However, I'm pleased I can play some small parts in any medical trials or a research programs which are seeking knowledge in order to find some answers to my issues.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Caron. Now, it's sometimes a bit of a difficult process signing up to research. You know, people, you know, do think, oh, what do I have to go through? And there's obviously a consenting process. Did you find that quite easy to do?
Yes, I found it relatively easy.
That's really good. Good. It is something that I know people sometimes get put off with. So it's good that you found that nice and easy. Can you share a little bit about sort of the experience? I know you've worked with some of the researchers.
Brain behavior group with May Caron and Jess Jiang. It involved hearing a task, a psychology task, a music task, and time tasks, and language tasks.
Sounds like they kept you really busy, Caron.
Yes.
It really does. And how does it feel being, you know, now you've taken part in research? How did that make you feel?
Very good.
Brilliant. That's really nice that, you know, you're getting something back from it, as well as giving so much, and so much that we really, really appreciate as well. So if there's any members watching today and they're thinking about taking part in any research, is there any advice that you would give them?
Without any research, we would be go for it.
That's brilliant. And I really hope they take your encouragement from that and see sort of how much you've got from it, because we are so grateful for you and to the other members that do participate in our research. It's so important to the future. Caron, I really want to thank you for sharing your experience with us today. And is it okay that people can send in some questions if they've got any queries about sort of your experience?
I would like questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Caron. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you both. Thank you so much, Caron. Thank you so much, Nikki. And Caron, I'm really pleased to say will be joining us shortly for the Q&A panel. So please do send in your questions. And I think that so much of what you said there, Caron, would have resonated with so many people, thinking about, you know, the length of time it took after you first noticed that something was wrong for you to get that diagnosis. I think that must have been incredibly frustrating, and I think sadly something that will resonate with a lot of people watching today. So before we get to the Q&A section, we've got one final talk, and this is a live talk. So this is from Olivia Wood, who is a member of the direct support team at RDS and a lot more. And she's going to talk to us about the RDS impact study. So Olivia, I'll hand over to you if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. And hello, PPA support group. It's Libby here from the direct support team and the impact study, coming to you today from a slightly gloomy looking northwest London outside today. I'm very excited to be joining you to quickly chat through some exciting recruitment opportunities in the Rare Dementia Impact Study. First of all, a huge thank you to all of those who have kindly already very generously volunteered your time to participate in the RDS Impact Study. We massively value your input and your efforts contributing to this. It's been such a great help to the study. And for those who are new to the impact study, let me tell you briefly a little bit more. So the RDS impact study is the world's largest study looking at support provided for people living with and alongside rare dementia. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about two aspects of the study, which we're currently recruiting for. If you decide to take part in the study, we'll of course be providing you with some further information about this and the projects you're interested in. And taking part in our study is completely voluntary. You can withdraw at any point that you wish. It's important to note that currently all of our research is taking place remotely. So you can take part in this study without leaving your home, without changing out of your slippers, but you will need a telephone or a computer with internet connection to take part. And the research is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and the National Institute of Health Research, and has been reviewed by the UCL Research Committee. So let's get on to the exciting bits. Okay, so first up, we have our individual interviews where members of our research team will be asking you a variety of questions about your experiences living with or alongside a person with rare dementia. Now, most of these questions require quite short answers, such as choosing an answer from a scale, saying that you strongly agree with something, strongly disagree, somewhere in the middle. But other questions are more open-ended, giving you a chance to tell us more and elaborate on your answer and give some examples if you wish. Now, these conversations would happen either on a one-to-one basis, so just yourself and a researcher, or with a close family member or friend present if you prefer. So who can participate? We've got people living with rare dementia, people supporting someone living with a diagnosis, and those who have formally supported someone with a rare dementia diagnosis. The individual interviews can last up to 2 hours, but don't worry, these interviews can be split into sessions if you prefer, and we do offer coffee breaks, time to stretch your legs in between. And the research team would also be asking you to complete some questionnaires online within a 2-week time frame. As I previously mentioned, all of our individual interviews are currently being held online via an encrypted video call platform called GoToMeeting, or over the phone if preferred. And if these individual interviews are something that you might be interested in participating in, please do email us at research@raredementiasupport.org. Okay, so next up, we have our online carer intervention. We are developing an online program for families and supporters of people living with rare dementia, and we're inviting people and our participants to help us test how easy it is to use and whether it can help provide better support, both to you, maybe as someone living alongside a person with the diagnoses, and for the person with the diagnosis themselves. We'll be asking you to fill in some questionnaires, and you'll either receive a program or alternative support, which you can complete at your own pace over 7 weeks. So again, who can participate? So anybody who identifies as an unpaid carer of someone living with rare dementia can participate. Unfortunately, this particular part of the study is not suitable for people living alongside someone with more severe dementia. However, the previously discussed one-to-one interviews are open to supporters of rare dementia at all stages. Again, this study is taking place entirely online. And if you're interested in participating in the online carer interventions, please do feel free to email us at research@raredementiasupport.org, or equally, if you have any questions about the individual interviews or online intervention, please do not hesitate to drop us an email. As we're coming up to the Easter break, there may be a slight delay in us getting back to you during this time, but we'll look forward to getting in contact with you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to chatting with some of you a lot further. And an even bigger thank you, because unless it was for all of you, our research simply would not be possible without you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I forgot that you were live then. That was such a professional presentation. That was great. So thank you for that. And if I can invite all of the panelists to join us now, so if you can show your faces. Thank you. So many people here will be familiar to us from the talks that they've just given. I wanted to introduce Dr. Anna Volkmer, who of course co-leads the support group with me and Jason, and is an expert in speech and language therapy. We didn't focus on research in speech and language therapy during this meeting because we've done that previously. But any questions about speech and language therapy, then Anna is your expert. And also to introduce Dr. Anthipa Chokesuwattanaskul, who is a neurologist who's been working with Jason's team for the past year, and she works in Thailand originally, but is in the UK now, and has been a huge help to our group, and we'll be happy to answer any medical questions that you throw at us. And so thank you so much to all of the panel for joining. I think with that, we can turn to our first question. So that is, can you please clarify what tau is? So Anthipa, that feels like a question for you maybe.
That is a great question indeed. And tau is a protein that's present in everyone's brain, but the problem arises when it assumes an abnormal configuration and it doesn't function properly anymore in the brain. And so it causes losses of brain cells, which subsequently causes loss of cognitive functions of the brain. And this has been found to be the cause of abnormal brain functions in many neurodegenerative diseases, like Alzheimer's and many types of primary progressive aphasias, like the non-fluent ones.
Great, thank you, Anthipa. And I guess we don't want to get too technical, but there's different sort of types of tau malformations. So you might hear of sort of a 3-repeat tauopathy or a 4-repeat tauopathy, and in primary progressive aphasia, at least in the non-fluent variant of PPA, we tend to be talking about a 4-repeat tauopathy, which has an association with progressive supranuclear palsy and corticobasal syndrome as well. But yeah, that was a really nice summary. Thank you very much, Anthipa. And I think one thing I was reflecting on as we were looking at that talk from Nadia was just how complex this terminology is, and actually how inaccessible it can be, and how frustrating it is that in this set of language-led dementias, so much of the language that we use is so difficult and so inaccessible. So any questions like those, please do send them in, and we'll do our best to break them down. Okay, so next question. Can you test family members to see if they have the familial gene for PPA? So Anthipa, again, I'll come back to you for that one.
Yeah, that is a very relevant question. So the progranulin gene can be tested in the patients and their family members, but we usually approach this problem in a way that we would test the patient first to see if there is a mutation in that patient, and then we would consider testing in their family members. And we would have to keep in mind that testing for genetic mutations have several clinical implications. So that, as Nadia has said, that the progranulin gene can be passed on to your, you can inherit from your parents, and you can pass them on to your children in around like 50% chance of that. So we would need to have some kind of like a genetic counseling before embarking on these very important tests that might impact your life and your future plans.
Yeah, thank you, Anthipa. And oh, sorry, Anna, yes, please do comment on that.
Sorry, I just thought I'd mention that based on my clinical experience, it's the part of the care pathway in the UK that the people who have, so as a family member, if you decide that you'd like to pursue finding out whether you have a gene that you a part of that care pathway is that you do have this counselling, and then a lot of people then in that
process might decide that they do or don't want to continue down that path. So actually, it's quite a supported pathway that you can undertake. It's not just a straightforward one-off blood test.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I just maybe wanted to sort of re-emphasize, I think, something that we talked about earlier, which is that the majority of cases of PPA are sporadic, which means that they're not caused by a genetic mutation. A minority of cases of non-fluent agrammatic variant PPA are associated with mutation either in the progranulin gene or in the C9 or 72 gene. And in those cases, that's where the trials that Nadia was talking about are really helpful, because there's this window. Well, because of the way that the gene is inherited, we know that people are very, very likely to go on to develop the disease. So there's a window in which to stop them going on to getting that, which is why Nadia's presentation was so helpful to give that overview. Okay, so unless there's anyone else to come in on that, we'll move on to our next question, which is a question I think really for Caron. So Caron, what do you think is important for researchers to know if they might be working with people with PPA?
I don't know.
No problem. I mean, to ask sort of a follow-up question. So your experiences of working with Jess and May Carmen in the research, how did you find that sort of the things that they were asking you to do? Did they always explain them clearly? Did you always understand them?
Yes, I found it very helpful.
That's good. And another follow-up, if I may, when you're sort of out and about, you know, in the community, are there things that you wish other people would know about PPA that they might not know?
I felt a PA and not unknown for general public. My friends don't know anything about it. I've got a strict therapy that I've produced to tell them about it.
That's great, thank you. And I think Anna wants to come in there as well.
You're absolutely right, Caron. We talk about this a lot, don't we? That people don't know what PPA is. They don't. Other people. There's a huge lack of awareness of primary progressive aphasia, and you mentioned that you've developed a script to explain it to other people. And actually, something we haven't spoken about today in the meeting, and perhaps is something we should mention, is that the recent media attention that in around 2 relatively well-known people who've been diagnosed with aphasia, and that's not in those people. So one example is Bruce Willis, very publicly has announced that he's got aphasia, and he announced that it's not associated with a stroke. And some of the people I work with have mentioned that perhaps has helped people around them understand what they're living with primary progressive aphasia. So I'm hopeful that this kind of information might help our cause, but I think you're right that we do need to do more research and more work to develop that understanding. I'm really glad you mentioned that. Thank you, because that's been at the front of my mind since Bruce Willis was diagnosed, and or was diagnosed with this aphasia, because they have not stated that he has aphasia to do with PPA, but they have not stated what has caused his aphasia at the moment, but it has been at the forefront of my mind. We need to do something about that.
That's great. Thank you very much, Anna. And Livy, I don't know if in your experiences with the direct support team, I don't know if you come into sort of contact with health professionals who maybe don't know much about PPA and what your strategies are to sort of educate other people about these conditions.
Great question. So yes, we do have, so we support people living with rare dementia, their families, but also healthcare workers. And we've seen a dramatic increase in healthcare workers signing up to our membership over the last maybe 2 years, which is fantastic to learn more about rare forms of dementia, including PPA. We do have information. We're happy to have one-to-one phone calls, etc., to provide information and work in partnership as well with healthcare professionals to provide support on rare dementia.
That's great, thank you. And I guess the hope with that is that, you know, one day, Caron, you won't have to go, somebody in your position won't have to go through that awful process of sort of fighting to get that diagnosis. You clearly knew that there was something wrong, and what they were telling you wasn't correct. And hopefully with this, you know, the work that people are doing to educate neurologists and doctors and everybody to understand that these are conditions and what the symptoms are, might help people to get diagnoses earlier on. So thank you. So another question here, which is asking to elaborate on the relationship between hearing and brain behaviour. And so I think this is in relation to Jess's presentation, and I think it's a really good question. And I'll do my best to answer it, and then I'll open it up if that's okay. But I think we often think about hearing as something that happens at the level of the ear, and that is certainly true. We need our ears to hear, but we also need our brains to hear as well. And if we think about sort of the sounds that make, or the signals that make our way to the brain, it's really quite remarkable that sort of from the fluttering of an eardrum, we can then reconstruct this rich tapestry of sound. And you think about music, think about speech, these are incredibly complicated signals, and actually your brain is working incredibly hard to make sense of those signals. And so in PPA, in some kinds of PPA, what we see is that people have changes in the parts of the brain that are involved in those complex hearing processes. And so somebody might have difficulties, for instance, hearing one person speaking against the background of lots of other people speaking, or might have difficulty when the speech has been degraded in some way, for instance, on a telephone line or something like that. And so for some people with PPA, we do think that changes in the brain caused by the PPA might be responsible for those hearing changes. But of course, people might also have problems with hearing at the level of the ear as well. So you can sort of get this double hit of hearing in the PPAs. And so for some people, hearing aids may well be helpful. And for other people, we hear anecdotally that they're not so helpful. And so that's a big focus of Jason Warren's work, is to look at that in more detail. And he's actually just been awarded a grant by the Royal National Institute for Deaf People and by Alzheimer's Research UK to work in collaboration with some engineers from Imperial College London to look at designing algorithms for new smart hearing aids that could actually really help cancel out some of those difficulties at the level at the level of the brain in people with PPA, and really to help them to help people to make sense of the signals that are coming in. So I hope that answers the question a little bit. I don't know, Anna, if you wanted to add anything, or anybody else.
I was just going to say that you're the expert on this, really, in lots of ways, Chris, because this links in with lots of the research you do. And I think that was a really helpful explanation of the different levels of hearing, that where hearing can break down. So thank you. No, that makes complete sense.
No worries. I'll come to you more often for the support. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to another question then. So for the INFRONT-3 clinical study, it would be a pity to be in the placebo arm. So is there any chance of participating where I can be sure to be in the active arm? So Anthipa, I don't know if I can come to you, sort of a clinical trials question there, really.
I'll try to answer that the best I could. So because in the phase 3 clinical trials, the aim is to assess the efficacy and the side effect of the drug that we're interested in without being biased, because there's this placebo effect that could happen when a participant thinks that they're receiving treatment and they might feel that they feel better by receiving that treatment. So that's why we need a placebo arm to compare that to the actual treatment, so as to ascertain that the result we're getting from the trial is not biased. Because after the phase 3 trial, drugs are usually then marketed and approved for use in treatments of such diseases. So we want to be very, very sure that the results we're getting is not biased and is not influenced by the so-called placebo effect. So as the protocol for the clinical phase 3 trials, patients cannot know which arm they are designated into. So unfortunately, the simple answer is no.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anthipa. Yeah, I can totally understand where that question comes from. Completely understand that. And I think it just goes to show that those of you who do take part in research of any kind is really an incredible act of altruism, to be giving up your time and your energy, something that may have no direct benefit to you, but we all hope will have huge benefits to future people in similar positions to you in the future. Okay, so let's move on to another question. So I think this is another question for you, Caron, if that's okay. So this is asking about whether any of your friends or family have been involved in research into PPA in any way.
My husband, Bruce, has a carers group, a study, and he's taking a part in research with me.
That's great. Thank you very much. And Olivia, I don't know if you want to come in and sort of talk about the benefits of involving people with a diagnosis, as well as those friends and family members who don't have a diagnosis in research.
It's sharing experience and stories. So living with a diagnosis of rare dementia, you are the experts. You know more about that than any of us here today. And being able to share that knowledge through research is a fantastic gift to share. And as Chris said, we're very humbled by the generosity of people wanting to share their stories with us. So by getting those stories, I mean, I can speak from the RDS Impact study, where we are recruiting family members, but also people living with a diagnosis, just adds to such a richness of data. And Yeah, such incredible, valuable stories about how people came around getting a diagnosis of rare dementia, their thoughts, their feelings, and what support they've been given, as well as any thoughts on how we could better change support in the future to accommodate their needs.
Thank you, Olivia. That's really nicely put. Okay, we'll move on to another question. So I think this is probably a question maybe for Anna in the first instance. So this person says, my mum is non-verbal and cannot write legibly now. She uses a printed QWERTY printout, and she also gets yes and no mixed up. And my question is, why is it so difficult to get her to answer a question with thumbs up or down, etc.?
Thank you for that question. And that's tricky to answer. There could be a number of different reasons. We do know that for people who have non-fluent variant primary progressive aphasia, they often produce what we call binary reversals. So they say yes when they mean no, or no when they mean yes. But equally, for some people, if they don't understand what you're saying, they may not be able to, and that may be a separate issue, that may be a comprehension issue. So people who have all types of PPA may at different times in their disease journey have difficulties understanding what people say. So it may be difficult for them to reliably answer you with a yes or a no. And equally, I think your question was actually about using thumbs up, thumbs down, and in addition, sometimes, particularly people with non-fluent variant may develop, and it was spoken about earlier, that it can be, on occasion, non-fluent variant can be associated with an underlying PSPs, or so progressive supranuclear palsy, or a cortical basal syndrome. And in those cases, people sometimes develop, and even with, say, for example, a logopenic variant, people may sometimes develop, we sometimes see movement becoming difficult. So if the person is developing difficulties with movement, they may not be able to initiate or use the limbs as easily. And then the other thing to say is that cognition can be difficult. So people can have problems initiating. So actually, that's something people quite commonly say to me, that their loved ones have problems getting started. But that's without knowing your mum. I've had to give you lots and lots of different bits of information that may contribute to that. So it's a bit slightly difficult to judge, but certainly coming back to that first issue is that it's very common for people to get, even when they get their yes and no's verbally mixed up, they may at some point also find thumbs up, thumbs down difficult, this binary reversal. And so sometimes we can think of alternative strategies to manage that. So for example, instead of asking questions that require a yes or a no, people can think about rephrasing the questions, or even using objects and physical choices to point to. So that's the kind of thing that sometimes can get around a few of the things I've just spoken to.
That's great. Thank you very much, Anna. Okay, so we'll move on to another question. And so this person has asked, if a granulin mutation is not inherited, can it nonetheless be passed on to the next generation? Anthipa, I don't know if you might feel able to answer that one.
Well, thank you for that question. It's a bit tricky about this genetic inheritance. So generally, the progranulin gene is an autosomally dominant gene. So that means that if you have one of those genes passed on to you by your parents, you would variably express or develop the disease. This variability, if you have the gene, and whether you will go on to develop the disease or not, is called penetrance. So it's a bit technical, but so this progranulin gene has almost like nearly 100% penetrance. That means that if you have the gene, you are very likely to go on to develop the disease. So that means that if, for example, if you have the disease, then it's likely that you may pass it on to your children, but so the simple answer to that is that if you don't have the disease or you don't have the mutation, it's unlikely that you will pass that on to your children. But in the very less likely case that you have the gene but you don't have the disease, that means that you're not expressing the disease. Your children might still have that gene, but it's very, very not likely in the case of progranulin. But in another case, the progranulin gene may develop on its own without being passed on. That's called a de novo mutation. So that is another case that might happen as well. So it's a bit tricky, but I hope this is a bit helpful. I'm not sure.
No, I think that's really helpful. Thank you very much, Anthipa. It's I think it's a hugely complex area, and I think that was a really nice distillation of in answer to that question. So thank you. So we've been asked a few related questions about tinnitus, actually. So one person's asked, has there been a consideration of the link between tinnitus and PPA? And another person has asked, have you ever thought that tinnitus could be an early marker of non-fluent agrammatic variant PPA? And Anthipa, do you mind if I come to you quickly just to tell everybody what tinnitus is, perhaps, because I'm not sure everybody will know.
So tinnitus is a symptom that is when you hear like a ringing or buzzing in your ears, and that's caused by like an aberrant signal in the hearing. It might arise from a problem in your ear, or it might arise from a problem from the auditory part of the brain.
Yeah.
And it tends to happen when you're older, when there's degeneration of this so-called auditory pathway. Yeah, but Chris, I think you might be a better candidate to answer what is the connection between tinnitus and PPA.
Oh, well, no, that was a really lovely summary, and I think it's a really interesting question because there is definitely work from Professor Warren's group previously showing that actually that people with semantic dementia, semantic variant PPA, are more likely to have a history of tinnitus or hyperacusis, which is a related condition where people will sort of be very sensitive to sound and might find loud noises in particular particularly agitating. And in that study, they linked changes that they linked these symptoms to changes in auditory thalamus, which is so they were able to find a part of the brain that related to that. In terms of non-fluent variant PPA, which the question was about, I'm not actually sure, and it is something that we do ask people about, and maybe we should take another look if that's something that the person asking the question has wondered about. I mean, I would say as well that I have tinnitus, and it's a very common symptom for people to have. So I think we can often, and I certainly can be guilty of often sort of digging into things too much, and we sort of think that every symptom might be associated with the PPA in this case, when actually there might well be other reasons for those changes as well. But I think two really interesting questions there, so thank you very much for those. Caron, I was going to come back to you actually, if it's okay. We've been talking about all of these things happening with hearing, and I wondered, have you noticed any changes with your hearing, or have you found it's been okay?
No. I got tinnitus from years ago. About 10 years ago.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Yeah, and I think it's really helpful, because we talk about hearing being a problem for some people with PPA, but and for others it can be not so much of a problem. And I think that shows just how much variability there is across different people with PPA, and in a sense how hard it makes to study. And I think this relates back to what Nadia was talking about with her slide right at the beginning, where she was saying there's no sort of connection between a symptom and a proteinopathy, a particular type of protein that might be causing that type of PPA. And I think what our hope is with research like Jess's and Jason's is that one day we will be able to link symptoms to specific pathologies. And this relates a little bit to the question about getting yes and no mixed up, because there's some suggestion that perhaps people who have that symptom might be more likely to have a tauopathy, which relates right back to the first question that we were asked. And I think in the absence of having sort of ways to measure this through cerebrospinal fluid or through PET scans, then I think a really helpful way for the research to move forward would be to map symptoms to underlying proteinopathies, and that's exactly where the research that Jess and Anthipa are doing, led by Jason Warren, really fits in. Anna, sorry, you've had your hand up for ages, so let's go to you.
Sorry, I was just going to make a comment about how common hearing difficulties can be, and sometimes that in my experience the hearing difficulty isn't held by the person with the PPA, but is held by their family members, and that in itself can cause a communication breakdown. But so certainly we know that hearing difficulties, the number of people who have hearing difficulties increases significantly as they get older. So more older people have hearing difficulties. So of course, that's going to make all conversation and communication much trickier. So I guess my point was actually more that it's just to reinforce how it can be quite common and how it can cause difficulties that aren't held by the person with the PPA diagnosis, but by those people around them as well. So it's actually something that's really important for us to deal with, because potentially there may be lots of quite sometimes for people who don't have the PPA diagnosis, actually, if the people around the person are able to use hearing aids, that can actually solve half the battle for the person with PPA as well. So hearing is something that has a huge difficulty for lots of people as they get older, and is certainly something that the work that Professor Warren's doing and the work that Dr. Chris Hardy are doing together is something that will be really helpful to us clinically in knowing how to make more suggestions and practical ones as well.
Thank you, Anna. That's lovely. Okay, so we'll go to another question now, which is quite a quick one, I think. So this person has asked, can you please clarify what a channel is? And this was in relation to Jess's presentation. And I can have a go at answering this. So Jess was using sort of channel in the sense of the speech signal. So our speech is made up of many different frequencies, and Jess was dividing sort of the frequency spectrum into different bands or channels. And sort of the more channels that you have, the easier to understand the speech was. And when you reduce the channels right down to one or two, that's when it became really difficult to hear. So this is a completely artificial way of altering the speech signal. And the reason that Jess does this for her research is that it's sort of a model for what difficult hearing is like in the real world. So when we're with people in the research centre, it's not really practical to have sort of environmental sounds like buses and cars and background noises that are what we would call ecological. So instead we use this artificial way of reducing the speech signal, which means we can really measure exactly the point at which people start to find it difficult. And that's how she was able to produce that nice graph that she showed us, where she showed that that people with the non-fluent variant and logopenic variant tended to have more difficulties hearing when signal had been degraded than, for instance, people with semantic variant PPA. But of course, we know that there's individual variation within and across that as well. So that doesn't mean that all people with non-fluent variant PPA would have that same problem. Okay, so let's move on to another question. So question for you, Caron, again, if that's okay. So this person has asked, what support or strategies have you found helpful in your day-to-day life?
Script therapy, definitely I found that's helpful. As script therapy with Anna, I definitely find that's helpful.
That's great, thank you. I can see Anna giving you a thumbs up there. So the Kool-Aid.
Yeah. Script therapy is, we do lots of script therapy, both individually and in groups. And that's a particular speech and language therapy approach. So thank you, Caron, that's really useful feedback.
That's great, thank you. So maybe a couple more questions and then we'll draw to a close. So this person has written that given that mum is non-verbal and she can't write legibly and gets yes and no mixed up, would she be able to participate in research? I think the short answer to that is definitely maybe. I think that the team of researchers like Anthipa and like Jess and everybody really who works at RDS and the DRC are really used to communicating with people with difficult communication problems, and it's really important that we try to understand as much as we can from people who have these difficult communication issues, because otherwise we're not really understanding as much about the disease as we could and we should be. And I mean, Anna has done a huge amount of research into sort of speech and language therapy and ways that speech and language therapy can augment communication and ways in which we can sort of communicate with people who have these issues. And so we can learn from Anna's direct research and try to apply that ourselves. So I think it's definitely worth a conversation. And so please do get in touch. We'll send out all of the email addresses and everything after this session, so that you know exactly who to get in touch with. Okay, and another person has asked, said thank you to Nadia for her summary on current research. Where would it be best to go if we had any further questions about this, because it's all very technical? I think that's a really good question, and I think that touches on what we were talking about earlier, and I think Anthipa mentioned about this being a very, very complex issue. So what we'll do is we'll certainly include the email address for the clinical trials team at our centre. So if you have any questions about trials, you can get in touch with them directly, and we'll try to maybe produce a sort of a short summary, just explaining, going over again what Nadia covered in her talk as well. We'll try to make that as as accessible as we can. But it's a really, really complicated area, so it's a very fair question. Okay, so I'm being prompted to wrap up, so we will leave it there. So I'd like to say thank you so much to all of the panelists for your time and for your generosity. Thank you so much to all the people working technical wizardry in the background to make this work. So I think Shema, Claire and Nikki and the rest of Nikki's team. And thank you to all of you watching for your questions. So if there are any that we didn't answer, rest assured that we will produce written responses to these and email them around to you in due course. And to end, we're going to leave you with a video message from the National Brain Appeal. So thank you very much all for your time and for watching.
Hello, my name is Eva Tate and I'm the Major Appeals Manager and Manager of the Rare Dementia Support Fund held by the charity The National Brain Appeal. The National Brain Appeal raises money as the dedicated charity for the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and UCL Queen's Square Institute of Neurology. The National Brain Appeal raises funds for Rare Dementia Support's 2,000 members to help individuals living with rare and early onset forms of dementia, their families, friends, and healthcare professionals. And we also hold several other funds for FTD and dementia research. The funding helps not only the support group meetings in London, but also the regional support groups, admin and support staff, and all other associated expenses, including the new online support groups. When things return to normal, there are travel and accommodation bursaries available to help members attend the meetings. This year, we've raised our fundraising target to 300,000, and this will rise further to 350,000 by 2022 to develop and extend the service in the areas of education, support, and research, with the ultimate aim that everyone affected by a form of rare dementia will have access to specialist information and support, as well as contact with other people with a similar condition. We apply for grants from grant-making trusts, foundations and livery companies and have a wonderful group of supporters, some of whom are here today, who fundraise for us in an amazing variety of ways. We would love it if you would like to sign up to our RDS fundraising newsletter to hear more of these stories and receive news of how we can support this community. We have had people do head shaves for us. We have had a gentleman drive across the Mongolian steppe in a VW Polo, and we have lots of people who take part in runs and virtual runs as well. At the end of February, we held a gala dinner called Mission Possible, where we raised 110,000 for the expansion of rare dementia support. And we are delighted to announce that in line with this expansion, the charity is committed to raise up to 7 million to create the world's first centre of excellence for rare dementias. If anyone would like to discuss any fundraising ideas or the new capital appeal, please do feel free to email me or my colleague Alexis, our Senior Fundraising Manager, who will speak about the innovative new ways you can be involved in fundraising for RDS, even during this challenging time. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Alexis Gebby and I'm the Senior Fundraising Officer at the National Brain Appeal. I just want to start off by saying a huge thank you to all of you who already fundraise for RDS. We really appreciate all of your incredible efforts, especially at this difficult time. My role at the National Brain Appeal is to look after all the amazing people taking on various fundraising activities for us. We have had people challenging themselves to run marathons, cycle long distances, climb mountains, and even take on skydives, all whilst raising money for RDS. We also have wonderful fundraisers out in the community who organise golf days, hold coffee mornings, host choir and carol concerts, and even shave their heads. These people ensure that more people like you can be supported through rare dementia support. If you're interested in becoming one of our fundraising heroes, then please do contact me. I am here to support you with your fundraising, and I'm more than happy to chat about any ideas that you may have. While at the moment it isn't possible to take part in a sporting challenge or hold a big fundraising gathering in your local community, we do have some fundraising ideas, such as taking on a solo virtual run or walk, hosting a quiz for your friends or family online, asking for birthday donations in lieu of going out, or even donating money that you may be saving by not travelling to work or buying your daily coffee. Do get in touch with me if you would like to get involved. In the meantime, take care and we hope to see you soon.